For more than a century, school history curricula, documentaries, and popular mythology have repeated a single, dramatic story about how the modern world was plunged into the horrors of total war. That on the sunny morning of June 28, 1914, in the Bosnian city of Sarajevo, a 19-year-old Serbian nationalist named Gavrilo Princip stepped onto the running board of an open-topped Gref unstiffed motorcar, fired 2 pistol shots into Archduke Franz Ferdinand and his wife Sophie, and triggered an automatic, mechanical domino rally of diplomatic ultimatums that dragged 65 million soldiers into the trenches. But this story is fundamentally incomplete, and historically, it is wrong. The First World War was not ignited in the streets of Sarajevo by an anarchist's pistol. It was engineered over 3 decades through a ruthless, cutthroat global war of sovereign debt, imperial railway concessions, and high-stakes banking cartels fighting to carve up the dying Ottoman Empire and control the supreme energy corridor to the Persian Gulf. Behind the black and white images of marching infantry and muddy barbed wire trenches lies an intricate financial architecture of imperial rivalry, commercial espionage, and secret central bank transactions that mainstream political histories routinely ignore. The true drivers of the catastrophe were not Balkan radicals or royal assassination plots, but elite bankers, industrial monopolists, and treasury mandarins operating from the financial capitals of Europe. Georg von Siemens and the directors of Deutsche Bank, Sir Ernest Cassel and the British financial establishment, Maurice Rouvier and the syndicate of French investment banks, and the private armaments dynasties of Krupp, Vickers, Armstrong Whitworth and Schneider-Krusat. Their private struggles, a monumental German railway project through Mesopotamia that threatened British naval hegemony, billions of French gold francs pumped into strategic Russian mobilization tracks, the crushing sovereign debt apparatus of the Ottoman Empire, an existential battle over newly discovered Middle Eastern oil fields, and a catastrophic London banking panic in July 1914, are the true structural forces that made the global slaughter of 1914 mathematically inevitable. Most people assume the march toward Armageddon began when European armies mobilized in August 1914, but the true origin of the First World War starts 26 years earlier and over 1,000 miles away, in the opulent seaside palaces of Constantinople in the autumn of 1888. To understand why millions of European men died in the mud of the Somme and Verdun, one must first trace the explosive geopolitical rivalry unleashed when the German Empire challenged the financial and maritime supremacy of the British Empire in the Middle East. In 1875, the Ottoman Empire, crushed under the weight of astronomical foreign debts accumulated during the Crimean War and lavish palace construction, formally defaulted on over 200 million British pounds in sovereign bonds held by British and French investors. In December 1881, the European great powers forced the bankrupt Sultan Abdul Hamid II to sign the humiliating Decree of Muharrem, surrendering sovereign control over Ottoman state finances to a consortium of European bankers known as the Ottoman Public Debt Administration, OPDA. Headquartered in a monumental stone palace overlooking the Golden Horn, this private European debt cartel seized direct control over the Ottoman Empire's most lucrative tax revenues, including the state salt monopoly, tobacco duties, silk tithes, fisheries, and customs stamps, diverting hundreds of millions of gold francs directly into the vaults of bondholders in London and Paris. Desperate to escape the suffocating financial stranglehold of Britain and France, Sultan Abdul Hamid II turned toward a rising, ambitious European power that possessed no colonial territory in the Mediterranean, the newly unified German Empire. In the autumn of 1888, the Sultan granted a historic railway concession to a German banking syndicate led by Georg von Siemens, the brilliant chief executive of Deutsche Bank. Siemens founded the Anatolian Railway Company, constructing modern standard-gauge railway lines connecting Constantinople to Ankara and Konya. Then, during the flamboyant state visit of Kaiser Wilhelm II to Constantinople and Jerusalem in 1898, where the Kaiser declared himself the eternal friend and protector of 300 million Muslims worldwide, the Sultan awarded Deutsche Bank the ultimate imperial prize, the concession to build the Berlin-to-Baghdad Railway, known across European diplomacy as the Bagdadbahn. The Bagdadbahn was the most ambitious civil engineering and geopolitical infrastructure project of the late 19th century. An unbroken, 3,000-kilometer overland steel corridor stretching from Berlin and Vienna through the Taurus Mountains, Aleppo, Mosul, and Baghdad, terminating at the deep-water port of Basra on the Persian Gulf. In the secret concession agreement signed between Deutsche Bank and the Ottoman government, the Sultan granted the German syndicate exclusive mineral, mining, and petroleum rights for 20 kilometers on either side of the entire railway track. German geologists exploring the Euphrates and Tigris River valleys had already identified massive surface oil seepages around Kirkuk and Mosul, recognizing that whoever controlled the Bagdadbahn would control the richest petroleum basin on the planet. Here is the first major historical reality that conventional textbooks almost never explain. The Berlin-to-Baghdad Railway was viewed by the British Empire not merely as a commercial infrastructure project, but as an existential, lethal threat to British imperial supremacy. For more than a century, British global hegemony had rested upon absolute naval command of the world's oceans and undisputed control over the sea routes to India through the Suez Canal. An overland German railway from Berlin to the Persian Gulf completely bypassed the British Royal Navy. It would allow the German military to transport hundreds of thousands of troops and heavy artillery from Central Europe directly to the borders of British India and Egypt in days, without ever exposing a single ship to British naval blockades. In the private memoranda of the British Foreign Office and the Admiralty in Whitehall, senior British statesmen viewed the Bagdadbahn with sheer panic. Sir Edward Grey, the British Foreign Secretary, and Lord Curzon, the Viceroy of India, recognized that a German naval coaling station and railhead at Basra would split the British Empire in two, cutting off maritime communications with India, Australia, and the Far East. British diplomacy and intelligence went into overdrive to sabotage the German project. British agents in the Persian Gulf negotiated secret protectorate treaties with local rulers, most notably Sheikh Mubarak al-Sabah of Kuwait in 1899, legally barring the German railway from reaching the open waters of the Persian Gulf without British parliamentary permission. The imperial competition for raw materials and mineral wealth exploded in North Africa during the First and Second Moroccan crises of 1905 and 1911. Behind the bellicose diplomatic posturing of Kaiser Wilhelm II in Tangier, and the dramatic dispatch of the German gunboat SMS Panther to the Atlantic port of Agadir, lay a vicious, undercover commercial war between powerful industrial cartels. The German engineering and mining conglomerate Mannesmann Brothers had acquired extensive iron ore and mineral concessions across southern Morocco, seeking to secure raw iron feedstocks for the steel mills of the Ruhr Valley. However, French heavy industrial syndicates, led by the weapons manufacturer Schneider Kraussat and the investment bank Paribas, demanded an absolute French monopoly over Moroccan mineral extraction, utilizing French diplomatic pressure to exclude German competitors. In both crises, European stock exchanges suffered severe liquidity panics, and the German Reichsbank was forced to liquidate foreign holdings when French banks abruptly withdrew short-term gold loans from Berlin, proving that financial warfare was already being weaponized as an instrument of imperial coercion. Simultaneously, across the English Channel, the financial encirclement of Germany was being forged through the most massive sovereign debt transaction of the 19th century, the Franco-Russian alliance of 1894. Following the dismissal of Chancellor Otto von Bismarck in 1890, the impetuous young Kaiser Wilhelm II made the fatal strategic blunder of refusing to renew the secret reinsurance treaty with Tsarist Russia, leaving the Russian Empire financially isolated and desperately in need of foreign capital to industrialize its backward agrarian economy. The French Republic, burning for revenge against Germany following the humiliating loss of Alsace and Lorraine in the Franco-Prussian War of 1870, recognized an extraordinary opportunity to buy a military ally. Under the direction of French Finance Minister Maurice Rouvier and elite Parisian investment banks, most notably the Crédit Lyonnais, the Banque de Paris et des Pays-Bas, Paribas, and the Société Générale, the French financial establishment launched an unprecedented nationwide propaganda campaign to market Russian sovereign bonds to the French public. Between 1888 and 1914, over 12 billion French gold francs, representing nearly one-third of all French foreign investment, were poured into Russian sovereign debt by millions of ordinary French middle-class rentiers, teachers, shopkeepers, and provincial peasants, seduced by high 5% interest yields and patriotic government encouragement. However, in the secret military protocols attached to these French loans, Paris imposed strict, mandatory conditions. Tsarist Russia was legally required to spend tens of millions of borrowed gold francs constructing double-track, heavy-gauge strategic railways leading directly from the Russian interior to the German and Austrian borders, designed specifically to accelerate the mobilization speed of the Russian Imperial Army against Germany from 30 days down to 15 days. A central, driving obsession that dictated the military policy of Tsarist Russia in the years leading to 1914 was the existential question of the Turkish Straits, the Bosporus, and the Dardanelles. For the Russian Empire, the narrow maritime passage connecting the Black Sea to the Mediterranean was not merely a strategic waterway, but the supreme economic jugular vein of the Russian economy. Over 50% of all Russian agricultural exports, specifically the millions of tons of Ukrainian wheat that generated the foreign exchange, required to pay interest on French loans, and nearly 90% of all petroleum exports from the oil fields of Baku passed through the Turkish Straits on merchant steamships. When German General Liman von Sanders was appointed by the Sultan in late 1913 to reorganize and command the Ottoman First Army Corps in Constantinople, Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Sazonov panicked, concluding that if Imperial Germany gained direct military and rail control over the Straits, the Russian Empire would become a permanent economic hostage to Berlin. This brings us to the second profound historical reality that popular history ignores. The rapid Russian military mobilization that panicked the German General Staff in July 1914 was not an accidental byproduct of Russian military doctrine. It was a pre-programmed mechanical trigger paid for and mandated by French bankers. When General Helmuth von Moltke, chief of the German General Staff, looked across the eastern border in 1914 and saw Russian strategic railways being completed with French capital, he concluded that Germany was in a closing strategic window. Moltke and the German High Command calculated that by 1916 or 1917, French-funded Russian mobilization would be so rapid that Germany's military war plan, the famous Schlieffen Plan, which depended upon defeating France in 6 weeks before turning to face slow Russian mobilization, would become completely impossible. In the minds of the German military and financial elite, if a European war was inevitable, it had to be fought immediately in 1914, before the French banking syndicate completed the encirclement of Germany. To understand why the British establishment was so fanatically committed to naval supremacy in the years preceding 1914, one must examine the fierce, multi-billion-pound Anglo-German naval arms race. In 1898 and 1900, under the direction of Grand Admiral Alfred von Tirpitz, the German Reichstag passed the historic Navy laws, authorizing the construction of the High Seas Fleet to challenge the British Royal Navy. Tirpitz argued under his famous risk theory that if Germany built a battle fleet of sufficient size, Britain would be forced to make diplomatic and colonial concessions in the Middle East and Africa rather than risk catastrophic naval losses. The response from Great Britain was immediate, ferocious, and immensely profitable for private armament syndicates. In 1906, First Sea Lord Admiral Sir John Fisher launched HMS Dreadnought, a revolutionary all-big-gun, turbine-powered battleship that rendered every existing warship on Earth instantly obsolete. The Dreadnought Revolution sparked an astronomical naval construction race that consumed unprecedented portions of British and German national budgets. Private armaments conglomerates on both sides of the North Sea, Krupp and Thyssen in Germany, Vickers, Armstrong Whitworth, and John Brown in Great Britain, formed massive, incestuous cartels with their respective defense ministries, generating astronomical corporate profits by lobbying newspapers, manufacturing synthetic war scares, and floating billions in naval defense bonds on the London and Berlin stock exchanges. The technological transformation of naval warfare in 1911 introduced the final, explosive factor into the global geopolitical equation. The conversion of the British Royal Navy from Welsh coal to Middle Eastern crude oil. Appointed First Lord of the Admiralty in October 1911, a 36-year-old Winston Churchill realized that oil-fired steam boilers would give British battleships unmatched tactical advantages. Superior speed, instant acceleration, reduced engine room crews, and the ability to refuel at sea without returning to port. But while the British Isles possessed centuries of domestic coal reserves, Great Britain possessed strictly zero domestic oil. To secure a permanent, sovereign supply of petroleum for the Royal Navy, Churchill pushed a historic bill through the British Parliament in June 1914, authorizing the British government to purchase a 51% controlling majority equity stake in the Anglo-Persian Oil Company, the ancestor of modern BP, for £2 million. Founded in 1908 after William Knox Darcy struck oil in the blistering desert hills of Masjid Soliman in southwest Persia, Anglo-Persian became an official arm of the British state. To protect the oil fields of Persia and the massive refinery at Abadan, the British Empire was now strategically committed to controlling the entire Persian Gulf basin, putting Britain on an unavoidable collision course with the German Bagdadbahn terminating in neighboring Mesopotamia. The intense diplomatic maneuvering over Middle Eastern oil reached an extraordinary, cynical climax in London in March 1914, barely 3 months before the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand. In the boardrooms of the British Foreign Office in Whitehall, British, German, and Dutch corporate executives gathered to finalize the historic restructuring of the Turkish Petroleum Company, TPC. Under the guidance of the legendary Armenian oil financier Calouste Gulbenkian, the shadowy financial intermediary known across European bourses as Mr. 5%, and Sir Ernest Cassel, the parties signed the Foreign Office Agreement of March 19, 1914. The agreement carved up the unmapped petroleum reserves of Mesopotamia into an exclusive corporate syndicate. 50% was awarded to the British government-controlled Anglo-Persian Oil Company, 25% to Royal Dutch Shell, and 25% to the Deutsche Bank Syndicate, with Gulbenkian receiving his famous 5% non-voting equity stake. The European great powers were dividing the oil wealth of the Ottoman Empire on paper, even as their military staffs finalized the war plans that would tear the empire apart. When the diplomatic crisis of July 1914 unfolded following the assassination in Sarajevo, the fragile financial architecture of Europe did not wait for the first artillery barrage. It collapsed instantly in an unprecedented systemic liquidity panic. On Friday, July 24, 1914, as Austria delivered its ultimatum to Serbia, international investors on the London Stock Exchange, the Paris Bourse, and the Berlin Bourse panicked, liquidating securities and demanding immediate settlement in physical gold bullion. In the city of London, the undisputed financial capital of the global economy, the private merchant banks and bill brokers found themselves facing total insolvency. London held over £350 million in outstanding international commercial bills of exchange, short-term credit instruments financing global trade, with hundreds of millions owed by merchants and banks in Germany, Austria, and Russia. With international communications severed and foreign remittances frozen, the London acceptance houses could not collect on their foreign debts to pay their depositors. On the morning of Friday, July 31, 1914, for the first time since its founding in 1798, a period of 116 years that included the Napoleonic Wars and the Crimean War, the London Stock Exchange was forced to close its doors indefinitely to prevent total market liquidation. Panic spread to the Bank of England on Threadneedle Street, where citizens formed massive queues stretching into the street to demand physical gold sovereigns for their paper £5 banknotes, draining £10 million in gold from the central bank in 3 days. To prevent the absolute collapse of the British banking system before the first British soldier crossed the English Channel, Chancellor of the Exchequer David Lloyd George and Bank of England Governor Lord Cunliffe enacted extraordinary emergency state interventions. Parliament declared an unprecedented 4-day national bank holiday from August 3 to August 6, extended a general moratorium on all private commercial debt, and authorized the Bank of England to guarantee over £120 million in frozen foreign bills of exchange. To replace disappearing gold sovereigns, the British Treasury printed hundreds of millions of emergency paper £1 and 10-shilling notes, famously known as Bradbury notes after Treasury Secretary John Bradbury, permanently ending the circulation of physical gold coins among the British public. The immediate military strategy of the British Empire upon the outbreak of hostilities on August 4, 1914, was executed not on the battlefields of Flanders, but beneath the cold waters of the North Sea in a brilliant act of economic warfare. In the pre-dawn hours of August 5, the British Royal Cable Ship Alert severed the 5 German commercial submarine telegraph cables lying on the seabed of the English Channel, cutting Germany off from direct telegraphic communication with the United States and the Western Hemisphere. Simultaneously, the British Admiralty declared the entire North Sea an active military zone, enforcing a total, airtight naval blockade that banned not only military contraband, but food, fertilizer, and raw industrial materials from reaching German ports, cutting off German industrial conglomerates from global markets and slowly starving the civilian population of the Central Powers. To finance the astronomical, unprecedented cost of modern industrial war, the European combatant nations dismantled the financial principles of classical economics, unleashing a catastrophic flood of unbacked paper currency. In Berlin, the Reichsbank suspended the convertibility of the mark into gold on August 4, 1914, creating special loan banks, Darlehenskassen, that printed billions of paper marks backed merely by municipal debt and corporate promissory notes, while the imperial treasury issued massive patriotic war bonds, Kriegsanleihen. The German leadership, confident of swift military victory, deliberately chose not to raise domestic income taxes to finance the war, operating on the arrogant assumption that the entire multi-billion mark cost of the conflict would be extracted from defeated France, Britain, and Russia in the form of massive post-war indemnity payments. This fatal financial gamble sowed the monetary seeds that would detonate in the terrifying hyperinflation of Weimar Germany in 1923. As European battlefields consumed millions of artillery shells and millions of men in the autumn of 1914, the combatant nations burned through their accumulated financial reserves at a rate of tens of millions of pounds per day. Great Britain and France, having exhausted their domestic tax revenues, turned to the only nation with the industrial capacity and capital surplus to sustain the war effort, the United States. In January 1915, the British government appointed the Wall Street private banking house of J.P. Morgan and Company, led by J. Pierpont Morgan Jr., and senior partner Thomas W. Lamont, as the exclusive commercial purchasing agent and financial banker for the British and French governments in the United States. The operational heart of the American wartime economic engine was established in November 1914 when Henry P. Davison, a senior partner at J.P. Morgan and Company, traveled secretly to London to meet with Chancellor of the Exchequer David Lloyd George and Bank of England officials. Davison negotiated the historic Commercial Agency Agreement, which appointed J.P. Morgan & Co. as the sole, exclusive purchasing agent for the British Admiralty and War Office in the United States. To manage the immense deluge of contracts, Morgan created a dedicated export department at 23 Wall Street, directed by former corporate executive Edward R. Stettinius. Every single month, the Morgan Syndicate vetted, negotiated, and executed hundreds of millions of dollars in contracts for American artillery shells from Bethlehem Steel, rifle gunpowder from DuPont, copper wire from Anaconda Copper, locomotives from Baldwin Locomotive Works, and millions of bushels of Kansas wheat, transforming the entire manufacturing base of the United States into a private arsenal and granary for the Allied war effort. The formal diplomatic encirclement of the German Empire was sealed in St. Petersburg on August 31, 1907, with the signing of the Anglo-Russian Convention. For nearly a century, the British Empire and the Tsarist Russian Empire had been locked in the bitter global Cold War known across diplomacy as the Great Game, clashing over influence in Constantinople, the Caucasus, Afghanistan, and the mountain passes leading to British India. However, the rising industrial might of Germany, the construction of the German high seas fleet, and the forward push of Deutsche Bank's Bagdadbahn toward the Persian Gulf forced British Foreign Secretary Sir Edward Grey and Russian Foreign Minister Alexander Izvolsky to bury their historic animosity. In an extraordinary imperial bargain, the two empires divided the ancient nation of Persia into three artificial spheres of influence: a large northern zone under exclusive Russian military and commercial dominance, a strategic southern zone encompassing the Persian Gulf coastline under British naval control to protect emerging oil concessions, and a narrow neutral buffer zone between them, creating the triple entente of Britain, France, and Russia that confronted Germany in 1914. The geopolitical reordering of the Middle East was cemented on November 2, 1917, in a historic 67-word document that linked British imperial strategy directly to international banking dynasty networks. The Balfour Declaration, transmitted as a formal letter from British Foreign Secretary Arthur Balfour to Lord Walter Rothschild, a prominent leader of the British Jewish community and scion of the legendary European banking dynasty. The declaration pledged British government support for the establishment of a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine. Negotiated during the darkest days of the war, when the Russian Eastern Front was collapsing into Bolshevik revolution and German U-boats were strangling British shipping, British wartime planners, led by Prime Minister David Lloyd George, sought to secure strategic land buffers protecting the Suez Canal while mobilizing international political and financial influence in the United States, illustrating how wartime diplomacy was perpetually fused with imperial territorial ambitions and international banking connections. The destructive financial consequences of the war reverberated for decades after the armistice, culminating in the complete destruction of the French middle class's savings. In February 1918, following the October Revolution, Vladimir Lenin and the new Bolshevik government in Petrograd issued a historic revolutionary decree. The Soviet state unilaterally repudiated and canceled all 12 billion gold francs of foreign debt accumulated by the Tsarist regime, declaring that the Russian working class would refuse to pay for the imperialist war loans of the Romanov dynasty. With a single stroke of an ink pen, millions of ordinary French citizens who had invested their life savings, pensions, and dowries in French-guaranteed Russian railway bonds were completely wiped out. The repudiation destroyed nearly one-third of the total private wealth of France, crippling the French financial system and creating a legacy of bitter financial resentment that dictated French foreign policy toward Germany and Russia throughout the interwar era. This reveals the third critical financial reality of the First World War. The United States was transformed into the supreme global creditor nation, and American financial neutrality became an absolute myth. Operating from their headquarters at 23 Wall Street, J.P. Morgan & Co. coordinated over $3 billion in purchases of American steel, copper, cotton, wheat, artillery shells, and gunpowder for the Allies, collecting immense corporate commissions on every transaction. In October 1915, J.P. Morgan syndicated the historic $500 million Anglo-French loan, the largest foreign bond offering in American history up to that date, distributing Allied debt across hundreds of American commercial banks. By 1917, American commercial banks and private investors held billions of dollars in unsecured Allied war debt. Had the Allies lost the war on the Western Front, the American banking system would have suffered catastrophic insolvency, creating an irresistible financial incentive that made American military entry in April 1917 a structural economic necessity to guarantee that Wall Street got paid back. The geopolitical and financial patterns that ignited the First World War in 1914 bear an eerie, unmistakable resonance in the 21st century. Today, the world is once again witnessing the fierce, escalating confrontation between established maritime superpowers and rising continental empires over strategic infrastructure corridors, global supply chains, and sovereign debt dominance. Modern overland trade networks, transcontinental energy pipelines, semiconductor manufacturing choke points, and rival international currency settlement systems are the 21st century equivalents of the Berlin-to-Baghdad Railway and the dreadnought naval race. When major global powers view strategic infrastructure not as mutually beneficial commerce, but as a zero-sum weapon of imperial encirclement, and when international debt markets become inextricably bound to geopolitical alliances, the world enters the exact same combustible territory that detonated in 1914. Behind the cold calculations of sovereign bond yields, railway concession percentages, and central bank gold reserves lies a devastating, unfathomable human tragedy that permanently broke the spirit of Western civilization. Between August 1914 and November 1918, over 20 million soldiers and civilians lost their lives, and another 21 million were maimed, disfigured, or poisoned by toxic mustard gas. In the muddy crater fields of the Somme, 60,000 British boys fell in a single morning. In the flaming charnel house of Verdun, 700,000 French and German soldiers were slaughtered in 10 months of ceaseless industrial artillery bombardments financed by sovereign war loans. In thousands of quiet villages across Europe, an entire generation of young poets, scientists, farmers, and factory workers vanished into unmarked mass graves, leaving behind millions of grieving mothers, widowed brides, and orphaned children who had never heard of the Bagdadbahn or sovereign debt cartels, but paid for their imperial ambitions with their lives. The ultimate philosophical lesson of the First World War is that the catastrophic conflagrations of history are almost never caused by the isolated sparks that appear in the headlines, but by the dry, combustible timber of commercial rivalry, sovereign debt traps, and imperial hubris accumulated over decades by ruling elites. When sovereign states allow private financial interests and monopolistic infrastructure ambitions to dictate foreign policy, they construct an intricate, hair-trigger machinery of mutual destruction, where the slightest miscalculation can detonate an entire civilization. So when popular history tells you that the First World War began in Sarajevo on June 28, 1914, because a young Serbian fanatic fired 2 shots into an Austrian archduke, remember the deeper, documented truth. The pistol in Sarajevo was merely the match. The gunpowder had been packed decades earlier in the boardrooms of Deutsche Bank, the debt palaces of Constantinople, the gold vaults of the Bank of England, and the sovereign bond syndicates of Paris. If you rely on this channel for deep, documented investigations into the hidden financial ledgers and economic forces that truly shape world history, subscribe to Chrono Dominion. Hit the like button to help this documentary reach more thoughtful viewers, and let me know in the comments below. Do you believe modern trade wars and infrastructure corridors are quietly setting the exact same geopolitical traps today? Let me know your thoughts in the comments.